So the first thing I want to tell you, I'm not actually going to talk about opossum. But its title actually has a story to it. This is literally a question that I got at one of my talks when I used comparative approach in a more medical-oriented audience. Of course, the questions come, but why would opossum tell me anything about human pregnancy? And I think that we are not really doing very well with our narratives, so I'm going to try one on you today that I worked out. And it's really the comparative approach, I would say, is more on the evolutionary developmental side than on the population genetic side, especially when it goes beyond the species. And I will go a little bit into that as well. So I really would like to make the argument today for the need to study human traits in their phylogenetic context, to go beyond the human variation. I think that's necessary to understand human traits, to understand also the disease variation. But just not to be completely disappointing, this is the opossum species that is a lab species that people actually are studying a lot in the context of pregnancy. You see, it's like all marsupials. It gives birth to very, very underdeveloped fetuses, and they are nurtured then in a kind of a pouch here in maternal body. But what they are interesting for is that they actually already have placenta, even though they're not placental mammals in narrow meaning of the word. And of course, they are interesting in evolution of pregnancy because they are kind of in the middle in the intrauterine development. Okay, but that was all about that I wanted to say about the opossum here. The way I see the connection between the evolutionary, between the medicine and evolutionary biology is that both of them, of course, have their main focus on variation. And of course, in human medicine, that would be the pathological variation here on the verges of a normal variation. And in evolutionary biology, that's much broader. It would be, of course, we are relatively neutral whether it's pathological or not. It's the part of variation, and of course, it goes beyond the species. And I go a little bit further even, and I would say that even within evolutionary biology, there is a focus. There's a school of thought that is more focusing on the within species variation. So that would be the population genetic approach. And then there is another one that focuses broader on the differences between species. This is nothing that you have to study in detail now. It's just showing the phylogenetic tree of the eutherian mammals and then the distribution of characters across the species. And these are, in this case, the progesterone-related mechanisms in pregnancy. All right. So obviously, the human medicine would fit right into this questions about the variation. What you see here is distribution of different pregnancy lengths, and you have on the x-axis the gestational length, and then on the y-axis how many women give birth at what gestation length. As you see, this is a pretty broad distribution. So the 9 months that we are used to see as normal term is really a very narrow band here. And we decided, partially arbitrarily, of course, that preterm birth is a very common pathology here, is some part of this distribution, right? I want to make here one comment that gets me annoyed about something that gets me annoyed very often, and that is that we often talk about disease as about complex traits. So complex trait is a trait that is determined by many genes, right? And we often use this idea also about the disease. And I would say disease is not actually a complex trait. Disease is a part of the distribution of a complex trait, okay? And even though this sounds like maybe it's just a sloppy way of expressing the idea, usually the sloppy way of expressing an idea in one generation is a fact in the next one. So I think it's really important to emphasize that disease is a part of the variation. All right, but there is another thing that is, for me, conceptually missing when we are looking at traits in this way, and that is that there is, of course, much more to a trait than only the variation we are looking at. So all the developmental mechanisms and everything that is not variable in the population is, of course, invisible when we are looking at traits only that way, okay? So where does this come from? Where does this arise? It was really very early in genetics that Thomas Hunt Morgan actually explicitly formulated it particularly that way. So he was studying and I'm sorry for the resolution here, he was studying the color of Drosophila eyes and found his factors. And what he said to that is that in this sense, he assigned these factors to be the causes of differences between the Drosophila, right? And he said, in this sense, we may say that a particular factor P is the cause of pink, for we use cause here in the sense in which science always uses this expression, namely to mean that a particular system differs from another system only in one special factor. And that, of course, works for his question very well. He can be sure that everything else is equal, so that little thing is actually the difference maker between the Drosophila, right? But when we take this further and always look at the variation and equal it with the trait, then of course we get into trouble when we want to understand trait. Okay, we understand the difference. It works very well when we are looking into small changes and into small differences. Like here, of course, the variation is associated with different shapes of bird beaks in Galapagos finches, or we can use this approach to explain the coloration of bears here, because of course the white fur is advantageous for polar bears and so on. But note the red font, the white color of the different shapes of. This is not an explanation of either a beak or fur. It's an explanation of the color or shape, right? So when we go from variation to traits, we have to keep that in mind, and keep in mind that non-variable traits of development, non-variable part of development, therefore, is invisible in this sense. And I think that I'm putting here forward the oncogene because that's something that often brings me to boil, because the oncogenes are the genes for cancer, right? Of course, they're not genes for cancer. They're genes for growth or whatever, not for cancer, or the ones that have mutations for cancer. And of course, another less obvious effect of starting to think this way is that when, of course, the population variation is what your trait is, then you're much more prone to think that your trait is species-specific, and in that sense, human-specific very often, right? And of course, the problem is that very few, if any, are really human-specific. So, so you might now wonder, okay, all that is fine, but the disease is actually human-specific, right? We are actually looking into the modification of a particular traits in human. So why would we need to know more than that? And I think we need to know more than that, if not earlier, then when we start to think about what the treatment would be, because then we would want to understand the mechanism of how the trait is built and not just how it deviates in disease. And a good argument for that, and this has been shown for several studies, maybe the best known is the variation in invasiveness of placenta and the preeclampsia in humans, is that a lot of variation, including the disease variation in human populations, is actually continuous between species differences, under one condition, that we are actually looking at the same trait, so a homologous trait. Okay. All right. So why is this? Okay. All right. With that baggage in mind, I will just move now to my own studies. I work on female reproduction, as Manfred already said, and really the reproduction in mammals, and especially the female part, is kind of a mecca for evolutionary biologists, because it's so extremely diverse and complex that you can easily spend life on it. And what you see here are just a few pictures that describe this variation. We go here from external fertilization and, of course, development, to the internal fertilization, and then egg laying, to platypus with very, very weird system with egg laying and then nursing, to very, very short gestational length in marsupials, and then very long and intense already in stem lineage of mammals. Here, the armadillo and elephant. Elephant has a pregnancy of 22 months. It's quite amazing. And of course, human at the end. And there will be two cases that I'll talk you through. One is the work on female orgasm and its evolution, and also what it brings to our understanding. And then the understanding of human menstruation. All right. So let's go to female orgasm. So why do you think the female orgasm is such an evolutionary riddle? What about it? Come on. So as opposed to male orgasm, female orgasm is not...
It's not having a function?
Right. If you don't have it, it doesn't affect conception, right? So female can conceive without orgasm, right? That's the riddle about it. So this is the paper that I will be talking about. So how do we really explain something that has apparently no function? That's really the problem we go about. And of course, this whether or not it has a function or it has any effect on anything has been a long-standing question. Aristotle has been wondering about it. And he seems to not have been quite sure. In one of the books, he thinks it doesn't have a function, in another that it does. And of course, there are many, many, many adaptive hypotheses around. It would, go more than an hour to talk them through. These are just some of them. Suck-up being one that is maybe the most stubborn one, and it just means practically that it's the contractions of the female reproductive tract that suck up the sperm. It's really that charming, and it goes to paralysis of the female and prevention of promiscuity and so on. I must say that it has been tried, but no effects on fitness could be found so far. So no effects on how many pregnancies women have has been found. If you haven't read the book by Elizabeth Lloyd, you should, and it's not only for talking about female orgasm, so it's the case of female orgasm, but also because she makes a fantastic, really, really rigorous analysis of I think altogether 20 evolutionary mostly adaptive hypothesis for female orgasm. She rejects all but one. And that one is the byproduct hypothesis, the hypothesis that the females have to have orgasm because, well, females have orgasm because males have to have it for ejaculation, okay? So that's the idea. It's the same idea for why male have nipples and don't need them. But one really interesting point that she's making that is kind of making it hard to argue for adaptive function is that female orgasm is not strongly linked to intercourse. So it's actually the lowest rate is at the intercourse, and orgasm is much more common in masturbation. It's much more common in homosexual sex. So how is that adaptive? All right. So one thing to say about these studies is that most of this work on orgasm has been focused on humans, and I was I'm talking here for the comparative approach. So what do we do? Do we actually find orgasm in other mammals, or and if we do, how do we recognize it? And one thing to say about this is that we are, and as I already noted before, we are kind of like to explain human traits as being particularly human. So we make it hard by that if we put all the luggage of subjective description of the female orgasm into this box. How do we then recognize something that human in another species, right? And this is just an example of homology of forelimb. And of course, if we would insist on forelimbs having to look like this, like bird forelimb, like the wing, then of course it would be hard to find it with all the details, it would be hard to find it in other species, right? So we have to boil this down to something that is actually possible to be found in other species. All right. And descriptions are so many of the female orgasm that there are special publications on definitions of female orgasm. So it's really that bad. And of course, there's a kind of a classical orgasm description that is very on a very basic level. Masters and Johnson. These are the real ones, and the movie. I'm sure some of you at least know the sequel. It's actually pretty good. And what we came down with when studying it in a comparative manner is that the orgasm as a neuroendocrine event triggered by genital stimulation. All right, let me just very briefly address some of the important parts of the female biology, just to make it easier to understand what we are claiming. On the left, you see the ovarian cycle, which is practically the ripening of the follicle leading to ovulation. So this is happening, of course, in ovary. And then the leftover of the follicle that you see up here is the corpus luteum that produces progesterone for a while and then dies off, and in humans at least, the new ovarian cycle starts. What you see on the right is the regulation of ovarian cycle, and the regulation is from the pituitary here. You see the pituitary here, the gonadotropin releasing hormone that stems from the brain and signals to release the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone. So it's really the dialogue between the brain and the ovary, if you will. The hormonal one. All of this cycle is then reflected in the levels of the hormone that are also periodic. Here in humans, we see the ovulation here. The luteinizing hormone peaks at that time, and then the progesterone peaks afterwards, and estrogen is just before. But there are also other hormones. These are kind of better known ones. There are also other hormones that seem to be related with ovulation. Oxytocin a little bit before, and then prolactin at the the lower curve here is luteinizing hormone. So this way you know where the ovulation happens, and then the prolactin is up here. All right, so we know about this dynamic. What is interesting is that that orgasm triggers some of these hormones, and this is where our idea comes from, actually. And you see here the measurement in humans of prolactin in males here, and in females on the right. The coitus-induced one and masturbation-induced one. One thing that I wanted to point out here is that this figure is really awfully badly scaled. And this actually looks like this if we compare males and females. And what you see here is that this increase is quite female biased. So there's something going on that has to do with female biology here. We see something in oxytocin. This is really old figure, and I'm sure that there are better ways of measuring oxytocin today than there were in 80s. I just couldn't find anything. And then luteinizing hormone. It's very little of it that we see here, and one would also not really expect it. All right. There's another thing that is specific to female is that another way to show it is the PET scans of the brain, and what you see here basically from this figure is all of these lower ones are females, and all of the one upper one is the male. You see that this activation of pituitary is really quite female specific. So if I go back now and look at the prolactin and oxytocin and their function, there's a lot known about their function during the ovulation and support after the ovulation, support of the corpus luteum after ovulation. So, we have two big things. We have orgasm signals to pituitary. Why would that be if it has no particular function? And then the surge of the hormones that it triggers are very, very female biased. So the question then, how can we explain this if there was never any female specific function of it? And to that, I want to tell you another little story, and that is that the first part that I showed you about the regulation of the ovarian cycle is not general regulation in all mammals. It's specific to mammals that ovulate spontaneously, so that go from one to another without any induction from external sources. Okay, that's not true for all mammals. Many of them actually need induction for every time they ovulate. Okay, so that induction can be different in different mammals. But in most of them, it's the copulation-induced induction. So there's a signal that induces, this part looks very much the same. It's only what induces it that is different. Okay, and it's rabbit, ferret, cat are the best known ones. You can see here in rabbits right after, so the copulation takes place here. Half an hour later, the luteinizing hormone is at maximum. All right. So the idea of our paper was really to try to show that the female orgasm is a homologue of this induced ovulation, and that it got lost in some of the species, and the species evolved spontaneous ovulation. In order to show that, we predicted that induced ovulation must therefore predate the spontaneous ovulation, right? So the animals would be on the branches earlier than the animals of the phylogenetic tree, earlier than than the spontaneous ovulators. And for the second one, for the loss of reflex, we thought that something about the genital morphology might be changing if you suddenly don't need that induction anymore, right? So that was the idea. So to look at the first one, what I'm showing you here is the phylogenetic tree. And the phylogenetic tree has the branches in green where the species with male-induced ovulation are, and in black, those with spontaneous ovulation. And you see that there has been probably a lot of switching. I must also say that this data is really hard to find, and it's really hard to detect, to be sure that species that are living in natural environment are actually either one or the other. But what we do see is that the basal branches seem to be the male-induced ovulators. So it seems to be true that the male-induced ovulation actually predated the spontaneous ovulation. And for the second, let us look a little bit into the female genital anatomy. And I have to really excuse myself, but I want to make a point with this. This is actually a human anatomy book, and it misses the clitoris here. Right. So, but the point I really want to make with this scheme for that it's good enough is that we have three orifices here, right? We have the rectal, the vaginal canal, and the urethra. So three openings. And I will be showing them in a very schematic way. Here, I have added glans clitoris here. As you see, it's always on the anterior side of the bladder opening. But by far not all of the uterians have it this way. So we have everything from having one single opening, a cloac, into which urogenital sinus and the rectum are emptying. And then we have the bladder emptying into the urogenital sinus. What you see here is cervix and then uterus opening up here. And then we have this intermediate stage where we have rectum, urogenital sinus, and then vagina starting back here, and then the bladder opening somewhere very close to the opening of the urogenital sinus. But what is important here is that we have glans clitoris here completely inside of the copulatory canal, here also quite inside, but here quite at a distance to the vagina, right, to the opening. So when we now plot this onto our phylogenetic tree, what we see is that you have seen this one already, and this is the second one. What you see is this is just a distribution of how the genitalia look like. What you see is that the green branches correlate between those two plots, right? And what this means is that most of the male-induced ovulators actually have the clitoris on the inside. And most of the spontaneous ovulators have it on the outside. So what that means is that the lack of female orgasm might not actually be a pathology, as it's often put forward, has been put forward from Freud on, at least. But it's really just an evolution of anatomy. And so for many women, therefore, the treatment would entail rather increased stimulation than development of a pill, right? All right. Okay, so let us change gears and go to menstruation now. Everything clear on orgasm so far? Yeah. Okay. So this is a different idea, and this is the whole title. Menstruation uses a mechanism that is co-opted from the parturition. And let me just give you a little bit of a background on menstruation. We started before already with ovarian cycle. So females, mammalian females are cyclical. This is a human plot, but it looks similar in most. But it's not just ovaries that are changing and all the hormones that I was talking about before. But if the fertilization actually happens after ovulation, then also the uterus is changing big time. It's changing in a way that its cells, specifically the stromal cells, change their form and their character into decidualized cell. This is called decidualization, and it's there for embedding of the conceptus. All right. This kind of change actually evolved very early in the stem lineage of placental mammals, and it evolved at the same time that also the hemochorial placentation evolved. Hemochorial placentation is a very invasive placentation that mammals have. Invasive, I will come to invasive right away. So it seems to be that the cells are actually the protective layer for the maternal side in order to support this invasive pregnancy. What I mean by invasive very, very quickly, these are kind of 3 stages of invasiveness from very non-invasive placentation to most invasive placentation. And what you see here is practically that the number of layers that are between the maternal and fetal blood is being reduced. And what happens really in hemochorial, the one that also human has, is that when the fetal placenta develops and attaches, it really opens the maternal vessels and becomes embedded into a bloody space. So mom's vessels are open, fetal vessels aren't. So it's really this is one of these structures called the villi that is really exposed here. In human, it gets even more invasive. In humans, the cells of the fetus actually wander into maternal tissue and stay there after birth. So those of you that have given birth have cells of your kids in your body too. Okay. So I told you about the induced decidualizers, so the ones that only decidualize when they get pregnant. Okay, it's really a signal from the conceptus that triggers it. Humans do something more. They decidualize every cycle, independent of whether or not there is a signal from a conceptus. Okay, this is kind of an internalized system, and they shed this transformed lining afterwards. And so after every cycle, and that's what's called menstruation, right? Why? We don't know. But one hint that we get from looking comparatively to it is that all of the species that actually have evolved menstruation have a very long gestation. So not only that they are invasive, most of mammals are, but they have evolved a very, very long gestation, and even in many of these cases, very even more invasive ones, like in humans, where we have the cells going in. So these are the ones. Spiny mouse, for instance, is an interesting case. Most mice and rats have a gestation length of 20 days. Spiny mouse is 40 days, right? Double. That's quite an amazing feature. All right. So to answer the question why menstruation happens, it's probably because this spontaneously decidualizing tissue has to be removed before the next cycle can happen and before implantation can happen. And with that, we have perhaps a little less of a necessity to explain menstruation as a particular character, because it's not independent from evolution of spontaneous decidualization. Okay. Okay. So I told you that there is a parallel between the decidualizing the endometrium between pregnant and non-pregnant cycle. What we suggested recently was that not only that, but that actually also the menstruation is a parallel to giving birth. And perhaps some of you that have a little bit more problematic menstruations than others feel that very much every month in a way that it feels like you're giving birth every month. So what's really the evidence for that? If we look at what happens, and this is really a very reduced version already, but I know still very crowded. What happens to maternal tissues during birth is, there's a signal, there's a withdrawal of progesterone. We still don't know really what the signal is, so we don't really know what triggers birth in humans. And then there is a rush of pro-inflammatory chemokines ending up in prostaglandins, with really and of course further leukocytes that are being recruited, and really these two things happen at the end. There are cramps that are emptying the uterus, and there is a lysis of extracellular matrix. Okay, this is a common cascade for human birth. If you look what menstruation does, you have most of the same actors. And it's really not just the same kind of stages, but it's really also the same factors. That doesn't mean that fetus does nothing and the pregnancy is not something different than non-pregnancy. That's clear. But it means that there's an appreciable part of the mechanism that is actually already on the maternal side, and that is happening completely independent of the fetus. This is just the summary of the same. So I told you already, I don't think that menstruation has to have a very different explanation than the spontaneous decidualization has. And it's probably a way to remove the decidualized layer. And I think that menstruation was actually secondarily co-opted, from the birthing mechanism to clearing this decidualized layer. The reason why I say that it's co-opted is that, of course, those species that don't have menstruation still give birth, right? So giving birth was there before the menstruation was there. So it can be only a secondary co-option from that. And I call it serial homologue. You might know the idea of parts that are being repeated in the body that use the same development. All right. So what are the implications of this observation for biomedical research? I think it's a fantastic opportunity to actually do research on many of the mechanisms of the maternal side of both pregnancy and birth, if we can get the cells completely non-invasively every month, right? So, and I think that's the picture that you see down here is just a picture of the cells that are actually in the menstrual blood. They can actually still be cultured. Many of these cells are living cells and can be cultured and analyzed as normal primary cell culture. Okay. So just to pull this together a little bit, I think that the focus on within species variation, just focusing on variation when we say everything else equal, can really be complemented nicely with trying to figure out what everything else is, right? And I think that what results, I hope I could convince you from both female orgasm research and menstruation research, is actually amenable to treatment and to thinking about the disease. And right, one thing that I cannot leave out is that really, really, really central to this kind of research is that we can make sure that we are looking at homologous traits. And that's not always easy. It's not always obvious. And at the end, of course, the opossum, what can a possum do? Alone, probably not very much, but with including it with many, many other species, I think a lot. All right, this is not the end. I have a little bit of time. I would like to spend 5 minutes, a little bit of thinking about the medicine and society, and not just medicine and society, but science and society in general. This is kind of the way I look at this picture, and especially if you work on female biology, sooner or later you kind of bump into these issues. So I look at the current research models as what the researchers think about it. Then there is, of course, the layer of interpretation that is our biological narrative and medicine. These are kind of the textbooks, what textbooks think about it. It's usually not the same, right? And then, of course, there is a societal interpretation. There's another level of it. And all of this, of course, interact. The way we ask questions is, of course, reflecting the way we think about things, right? So, I think it's important to ask the question whether we can do a better job getting rid of some of the really weird attitudes by knowledge. And I'm not going to answer this question. It's something to be put into the space into your heads as well. So really, can knowledge of evolutionary history help overcome the troubled perception of female biology? And what do I mean with troubled perception? I'll give you a few examples. There are 3 classes that I became very aware of. One is an enormous ignorance about female anatomy. It's very hard to find female anatomy, any comparative female, especially genital anatomy, in books. It's just hard. There is a really very problematic reduction of female biology to reproductive purposes, and strong focus on fetus. I will show you examples of each one of them. And then outside of reproduction, then it's usually female traits become very inconvenient or useless. This is a quote from book on early humans and their world from 2004. And what I want to draw your attention to, okay, I have not shown you. So I apologize now to women everywhere, but someone has to say it. Your sexual organs are really upside down. I had several people coming asking if that's really true, and he explains this then in a weird way how this is nothing particular, but this is really really giving a weird signal. And so what he really has a problem with, and this will be a little bit graphic. So this is what he has a problem with. This is his up and down, and it's really dorsal and ventral. It's not up and down. I mean, okay, then the focus on the fetus. This is a study showing the female mortality after birth, and it's hard to be very proud, right, on this. It's really the women dying soon after birth, and if you compare here Finland with percentage in US, then you see that there's a 7-fold difference. And then after pregnancy and childbirth, if you pay attention, these are everywhere. So how do we have to repair the signs of having been pregnant? Why is that so bad that we have them?
Because they're not supposed to turn in, and we're completely shredded in our
yeah, that's very often not the cause of these. Yes, that is true. There are consequences that are really problematic, and I acknowledge those absolutely. Yes. This is another suggestion. Menstruation is obsolete. We don't need it. You know, it goes on and on. But as I told you, we actually don't understand menstruation very well. That's another one. Sorry, these were supposed to be underlining this, not crossing the. That's another suggestion to do away with menstruation, because it's of course inconvenient, and again, there is a percentage of women where it's very, very painful, and where you want to get rid of it. That's a different case. But the suggestions here are all convenience suggestions. Why? And just to tell you what endometrial ablation is, it's really scarring or removing or burning the uterine lining. Of course, you cannot give birth afterwards. If it happens, it's actually very dangerous. Okay, so where do I want to go with that? I'm just asking whether with understanding the biology better, we could do better to not go into this directions of thinking. And I think it's necessary to ask this question. And I'm just paralleling here the two ways of thinking about it. On the one hand, female orgasm either is adaptive or it's not worth our attention. And if it's adaptive, and then the lack, of course, is pathological. And menstruation is a lost opportunity for pregnancy or just obsolete. And as an alternative, ancestral orgasm like reflex did have a function, and the lack of it is just an anatomical consequence. And therefore, if you want to resolve it, one thing to do is just simply change the behavior, and not necessarily take the pill. And then on the other hand, menstruation as a necessary process, it's not particularly comfortable or anything like that. But I think if we can change the attitude towards it, it might be even easier to deal with. And I will leave you with that. These are my collaborators. I work with Dr. Norwitz from Tufts on trying to put that thinking about menstruation into work, to see whether we can associate the menstrual fluid with analysis with the actual diseases. And then Catherine Burns is my colleague at the Cincinnati Children's. That she's really actually at the medical school directly. She works on endometriosis also in this context, and my funding comes from March of Dimes and from Cincinnati Children's. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihaela. I'm sure that triggered quite a lot of questions. So for purposes of recording, you need to use the microphone.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
I was wondering whether you also looked at or have some thoughts about the human hidden ovulation, because that's another unexplained territory, right?
So there's quite some discussion of how hidden it actually is. Obviously, it's not as obvious as in some monkey disease, and I guess we don't do lordosis and all the other. But I think that there's quite a lot of support that we actually act differently during ovulation. And one study that I always bring up, because it comes to my mind as a first one, is the colleagues at the University of Vienna have done that a long time ago. They have shown that during the ovulation, women young women in discotheques actually show much more skin. So to what extent, what's hidden, what isn't, I don't know. Yeah.
Other questions?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about the research that you're doing with the menstrual fluid and preterm birth?
Right. So these are a little bit in different questions. The menstrual blood, we are trying to grow the cells to be able to assess them. But we have together with my colleagues from Children's, they have done the GWAS study recently on preterm birth, pointing to some of the really very likely candidates that might be involved in preterm birth. And one of them we are following functionally by using the same cells that are being shed in the menstruation, but we have those already in culture. We are at the same time also using the cells, and that's really an interesting point. We are at the same time also using the cells that are from endometriotic patients. And the reason is that there seems to be a correlation it's really anti-correlation between the preterm birth and the endometriosis. One of the loci is in common. And it seems to be affecting the gestational length positively, but endometriosis negatively. And so that's the plausible biology here, and I'm really waving hands here because we don't really know, but the plausible biology here is that something about these cells that are decidualizing is supportive for good implantation and therefore probably the length of pregnancy, but at the same time has a trade-off that they are probably able to re-implant in the sense of reattach in other parts of the peritoneum. So endometriosis for everybody is really reattachment of the cells that are shed from uterus in other parts in peritoneum, because they can backflow through the fallopian tubes and come into the peritoneal cavity. Those are open to the peritoneal cavity. So that's the possibility. Thanks.
How does your menstruation theory explain double ovulation in humans, in female humans?
Double ovulation?
Yeah, which is my understanding that it's a thing, although very rare. How does your theory explain that?
I don't think it does. I'm not sure that it needs a particular explanation. So you mean the simultaneous ovulation of more than one egg? Yes. So just again, I will be hand waving because I don't really know the real answer, but the ovulation we have monoovulation most of the time. But of course, that is also not something that's relatively recent evolutionarily, right? So it's not something that is a rule for mammals. So there will be a way how it evolved from polyovulating to monoovulation, and that's probably what is disturbed. But yeah, I don't know what that regulatory mechanism is. That's really the answer. Yeah.
Let me ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
Based on what you said in the beginning about the need to understand what actually complex trait and complex disease means, and what you then said throughout the talk about a lack of a certain kind of knowledge in the medical literature.
Right.
How would you then say, for a center that focuses on evolution and medicine, how important is it that we actually completely rethink the way we structure the basic building blocks of what it means to understand, let's say, the human body and its diseases, going away from a sort of gene-centric point of view and more to a system-centric point of view. That includes, of course, the deep history of those systems.
Right.
Because we're only looking at the kind of Morgan-type difference makers, but we are not looking at the causality that is implicit in those systems. So how do we change that?
I think it's fundamental. It's the comparative developmental biology that this is missing in most of the these studies, and it's that said. I think the of course Morgan's approach does give us candidates. It's not that it's either one or the other. But we should not think that those are enough. We have. It's very, very obvious once the for instance, mapping genes gets so good that we can actually reliably think that some of those candidates are probably okay and causal, then it becomes very obvious that the next step, you actually have to know what they do. And from then on, it doesn't help to know which genes. You still have to know how they act in order to do any treatment or any manipulation, right? Or even just to be sure that you are having the right thing. So it seems it would be the biggest part would be missed if we don't know about that. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any further questions? If not right away, there is, as usual, an hour reserved for tea and more informal chat right next door in the center. So feel free to hang out or come back and talk to Mihaela there. And so all that is left then is to thank you once again.
Thank you. Thanks.